Now, we're not the only ones who would disagree with the IPCC. I want to mention particularly the Fraser Institute in Canada, which was one of the first to issue a comprehensive answer to the IPCC, and there were others. And I want to mention particularly the latest effort by a group of NASA engineers and scientists, retired, who published a report under the name of the Right Climate Stuff, TRCS. And you can look it up under the rightclimatestuff.com. It's available on the internet. They, of course, got inputs from a variety of experts who lectured to them, and they had discussions within the group and came up with a considered report that disagrees completely with the IPCC. So we're on the same wavelength with the TCRS, but I will be talking about the NIPCC, since this is essentially what I'm involved in. Now I want to mention that we have here in the audience one of the co-originators of the NIPCC, and that is our friend Willie Soon. 10 years ago in Milan, if he remembers it, we got together a small group of us from North America, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, to discuss how to respond to the IPCC. They had just published their report on 2001, which, as you remember, featured the hockey stick. And we're very upset about this, particularly Willie was very upset about this. So we decided to set up something called Team B. And I don't remember who had the idea of saying, well, Team B, that doesn't sound very sexy. Let's call it something else. So somebody else, not me, came up with the name of NIPCC, and that's what it is now. It's pronounced in various ways. I pronounce it NIPIC. Joe Bass pronounced it NIPCC. I don't know how. NIPCC will do. All of our reports are published on a webpage, which is NIPCC report, one word, .org, NIPCC report.org. And I don't have to tell you about the IPCC. They are publishing their 5th assessment report this September, and we're ready to meet them with our report called Climate Change Reconsidered, our full report, which will be just as thick as theirs, and that will be published also in September. And my collaborators on that are Craig Itzel, who many of you know, from Tempe, Arizona, and Bob Carter, Professor Bob Carter from Australia. Craig is a big expert on the bioeffects of climate, but on almost everything else. And his father, of course, is a distinguished pioneer in fighting global warming. It's Sherwood Itzel. Sherwood is lucky to have 3 sons who are all following in his footsteps. And that's, I think, is the greatest compliment a man can have, to have your sons follow in your footsteps and be distinguished in their own right. So there's Craig Itzel, and then there's Bob Carter in Australia, who is a paleo-marine geologist. I'm an atmospheric physicist, so we complement each other. Just a word about my own background. My first encounter with the climate issues came, believe it or not, in 1948. That's a long time ago, I know. We put cameras into captured V-2 rockets, which were fired from White Sands, New Mexico, and we got the first cloud pictures. My interest in those days was not in clouds. That was the interest of Dr. Harry Wexler, chief scientist of the U.S. Weather Bureau, who is the father, I would say, of satellite meteorology. My interest in those days was to find out where the horizon was, so I could find out the orientation of our cosmic ray telescopes. So my job was to reestablish the position of the rocket in space from the study of the horizon and the magnetic field, which we also measured. And from that, we reconstructed the position of the telescope, and we knew which way it was pointing. If you don't know which way your telescope is pointing, it's really not much use. So that was in '48. Later on, of course, I wrote about satellite meteorology, drawing on Harry Wexler's experience. And finally, in 1962, I was put in charge of setting up the Weather Satellite Service for the US Weather Bureau. We had big fights with NASA at the time, but they did a good job of supplying us not only with the satellites, but also the launch services and the continuing support it takes. And our job was to persuade meteorologists to use satellite data. In those days, that was a very difficult problem because they were used to getting temperature and wind data every 4 hours. Satellites don't work that way. We only got cloud data, and for a long time they didn't quite know what to do with cloud data, and we worked on how to interpret cloud data. My entry into the battlefield, you might say, mirrors exactly that of Anthony Watts. I also was motivated by Jim Hansen. We all need to thank Jim Hansen for motivating us in 1988 to get started in this field. I got so upset by his testimony before the Senate, before Senator Worth and Senator Al Gore, that I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about the myths of global warming. You'll find it there if you can go back, or I can send it to you if you write to me, or if you write to DDP. In any case, that's 25 years ago. That's a long time to be in a battle. And the good news is that we are winning. For the first time, and this is the real breakthrough that I will be talking about, a National Academy of Sciences has recognized our merit, and it's the Chinese Academy of Sciences that has translated our books into Chinese, published them, and just organized 2 weeks ago a workshop in Beijing, which I attended, and we gave our presentations, and we had a large attendance. I'm not saying that the Chinese Academy of Sciences supports NIPCC, but at least they're willing to give us a platform, and that's very important. That's a real breakthrough, because the British Royal Society and the American National Academy of Sciences is not willing to give us a platform. So the Chinese are the first National Academy to give us a platform and to allow us to propagate our views and explain why we disagree with the IPCC. Let's see what else it says here. The bad news. The bad news, yes. The bad news is that someone has persuaded Barack Obama to institute a climate policy. I'm sure he doesn't give a hang about climate one way or the other, but his constituents do, and he's very anxious to please many of his constituents. So it is a matter of misinformation which has found its way up into the White House and is now trying to determine national policy. You've heard a lot about this yesterday, particularly about the EPA, how Obama hopes to circumvent the Congress by using the EPA to institute climate policy, which is really energy policy, which is really policy that determines economic growth in the United States. So we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about jobs. All of this depends on having a climate policy. And the key to that, believe it or not, is the fact that the Clean Air Act is being used to defame carbon dioxide, a perfectly innocent gas, natural gas in the atmosphere, is being defamed as a villain that will cause climate catastrophes. Nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. We don't find that. In the contrary, carbon dioxide is plant food, and everything, all life on Earth depends on the existence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in Beijing, I was privileged to thank the Chinese publicly for putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and advancing global agriculture, because all the hungry people in the world will benefit from having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's our view. What will happen in the future, we don't know. My organization, the Science and Environmental Policy Project, SEPP, is one of the co-plaintiffs against the EPA endangerment finding. We want to demonstrate through the courts that CO2 should not be a pollutant. It should not be regulated under the Clean Air Act. It seems to me that Congress can do something about this by simply amending the Clean Air Act and saying that CO2 is not a criteria pollutant. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know why they don't do this. Perhaps they have a good reason. But it seems to me that there would be many in the Senate, including Senate Democrats, who would support this. And it would be difficult for the White House to veto such an amendment. But that's just a personal view. Now, I would want to tell you that we've reached a good stopping point, and perhaps I need to go back to what I was doing before I got involved in the climate business, which is to be concerned about the solar system, particularly about the development of Mars, which of course is our neighbor, not the nearest neighbor, but our neighbor who shares many features with the Earth, and we can learn a great deal about the development of the Earth, our Earth, by studying the development of Mars. But you know, it's going to be difficult to leave climate business. There's so many interesting unsolved problems. One of the most interesting problems was touched on yesterday by Willie Soon. That's the problem of sea level rise. It's a problem that's bedeviled by bad data, conflicting data. Whose data should we believe? Yesterday we got a good exposure to that, and I hope to study this subject because it is an important subject, because so many people believe that sea level rise is connected somehow to climate change and somehow connected to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I don't think it is. But we need to prove this. We need to demonstrate this. There are many other interesting problems. For example, why does CO2 not cause much or even any global warming? There are two views on this, which were partly expounded yesterday by Anthony Watts. One, of course, is that there's a negative feedback in the atmosphere which cancels the effect of CO2. That's one view. This is a view held by many important scientists like Richard Lindzen, Roy Spencer, and others. There's another view, which is that CO2 saturates, that we've reached a saturation point where adding more CO2 will not make much difference. I tend to go with the second view, but we need to demonstrate this. And I plan of demonstrating it, but it's a research plan that involves analyzing a lot of data, and I'm very allergic to doing this because it's a lot of work. Anyway, we'll see how it all works out. So let me go on now and go to my talk. First of all, I want to pay tribute here in a negative way to our former President George W. Bush. He had many good features, but one of the things he did was to keep alive the alarmists by feeding them money. If George Bush in his 8 years had cut off the alarmists, I'm sure we wouldn't have any problems today. But he didn't. To his credit, we didn't ratify Kyoto. He spoke out against CO2 causing climate change, but he acted differently. Under his tenure, we developed wind and solar energy subsidies, and many other things that have now ingrained global warming alarmists and made them dependent on subsidies from government, which have strengthened the alarmist NGOs. That all happened during his administration. So you can't blame Obama for everything. It's a blame that has to be shared. In my personal experience, I had 3 big disappointments, which I want to mention to you. 3 personal disappointments. When Bush was first elected, I was jubilant after Clinton, and therefore I tried very hard to get on the staff of Vice President Dick Cheney. I figured that Cheney would exercise a moderating influence on Bush, and that was the right place to be, because I thought Bush would be too busy to listen to the science of climate change, but maybe Cheney would. Didn't work out. My second disappointment came when I was considered to be in charge of the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program, essentially number 2 in NOAA, as a deputy to the NOAA administrator and as an assistant secretary of commerce. Someone in the White House killed the nomination, even after I'd gone through all kinds of interviews. The third big disappointment came with the Supreme Court. You all remember that in 2007, there was an important case. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts sued the EPA, probably by collusion. I'm sure it worked that way, where EPA said to Massachusetts, please sue us so we can go to the Supreme Court. Well, anyway, Massachusetts sued EPA about carbon dioxide. In order to be able to sue, Massachusetts had to establish what is called standing. That's a legal term. They had to show that CO2 would damage the state of Massachusetts. How did they do that? Well, they produced an affidavit. I studied that affidavit. It's a false affidavit. I tried to tell this to the Department of Justice. Our Solicitor General, that is George Bush's Solicitor General, argued the case before the Supreme Court in oral arguments, wouldn't listen. I'm sure that if we could have exploded the affidavit and destroyed Massachusetts' legal standing before the Supreme Court, the case would have stopped. Instead, what happened, the case went to conclusion. I got a 5-4 decision from the Supreme Court that CO2 is indeed a pollutant and that EPA is entitled to regulate CO2 provided they can demonstrate that it is inimical to human health and welfare. That is the endangerment finding, which EPA then produced. So the Supreme Court gave the tools for regulation to EPA, but didn't direct them directly to regulate. They said, if you can demonstrate damage from CO2, then you can regulate under the Clean Air Act. I don't see how the Clean Air Act can be used for that purpose. The Clean Air Act, for example, calls for EPA to set national ambient air quality standards, NAAQS. It's in the law. How do you set an ambient air quality standard for CO2? What is it? What is a standard? Do you know? Does anybody know? Of course not. Can they set a standard? No. Can they maintain a standard? Can they show that regulation of CO2 in the United States will achieve this standard? No. So they can't fulfill the most important requirement of the Clean Air Act. Another requirement of the Clean Air Act is that they must demonstrate that they not only emissions will achieve the required air quality, but they have to control emissions down to the level of 250 tons per year. You know, there are millions of establishments in the United States that emit more than 250 tons per year. Every hotel, every apartment house, every hospital, every industry emits more than 250 tons a year. EPA could never handle this. So they arbitrarily imposed what's called a tailoring rule. They set the level, the critical level, from 250 up to, 250,000. They changed it, they arbitrarily changed it to something that's more convenient. And that will handle all the utilities and all the big industries. Well, you can't do that. It's in the law. They can't unilaterally change the law without Congress. Administrative agencies can't do that. So there are many ways whereby we can fight the EPA, and I hope we will. All right. I will now continue and quickly show evidence against anthropogenic global warming. Let me tell you why I made this list. In Beijing, 2 weeks ago, we met some very nice Chinese students at Tsinghua University. And they organized 2 talks for me. They did the organization, not the faculty, and I met many more students. And these students are fairly, not only bright, but fairly committed. So we want to give them all kinds of good questions to ask. Why? Because the Academy of Sciences in China is going to organize another conference, this time in favor of IPCC. They've invited some the leading lights from England and Canada and everywhere else to hold forth, and we want to have the students ask them some tough questions. And here are some of the tough questions. I'll go through them very quickly. Please explain to us why there has been no warming for at least 15 years. That's a nice question to ask. Please explain to us why the models that show global warming show that the Antarctic is cooling. Why the Antarctic is cooling while the models show it should be warming. Please explain to us why the models show a hot spot but the observations don't. Please explain to us how to explain the warming between 1910 and 1940, which is clearly not caused by CO2. The IPCC doesn't explain that. We think the cause is primarily natural. Of course, it must be natural, but IPCC doesn't pay much attention to natural causes of climate change. We do. And so on. There's also the disparity between the northern and southern hemisphere. Models do a very poor job of explaining clouds and precipitation. If you plot the observations against the models, you'll find big disagreements. The models don't show decadal oscillations. And finally, the models don't explain the Little Ice Age. Willie Soon has written a book about the Maunder minimum, which took place around, was it around 1700, isn't it?
Yes.
No, which is correlated with a sunspot minimum. So you have a climate minimum and a sunspot minimum at the same time. It's not a coincidence. There's a deep connection which needs to be explained and explored. So we'll see how these questions do, and we're now involved in a a slight sabotage of the forthcoming conference, IPCC conference in Beijing. Okay, here's the first example, which I'm sure many of you have seen. The black line here is the observed temperature by satellites, so that's the atmospheric temperature. Notice that there's practically no change from 1979 to 1997. There's a one-year spike, which is an El Nino, super El Nino. It returns to the previous value after the spike. There's a jump in temperature, which has nothing to do with CO2, because CO2 doesn't cause jumps. According to the models, it should cause a gradual increase in temperature. So this is a jump, which is obviously tied to a change in ocean circulation, not explained by models. And then you get no change again, even a slight cooling since 2002. All the time in the green line, you see CO2 is going up. That is, I think, one of the main facts that needs to be explained by the IPCC and by those who defend the IPCC at the forthcoming symposium in Beijing. Just to look at the second of these items, here is the temperature record from satellites. You'll see a general warming, which is of course produced because of the jump in 2001, 2002. But you see that the Antarctic is cooling, contrary to the models. Now, how does IPCC support its conclusion about anthropogenic global warming? Well, interesting, they have a special chapter in the report. Chapter 10 is called Attribution. It discusses their ideas of how to attribute the changes in climate, and of course they decide it has to be anthropogenic, produced by humans. The reason I know about Chapter 10 is because I'm one of the many official reviewers. I think we're called expert reviewers, but we're self-appointed essentially. It's not a very distinguished title. And we write comments to the IPCC, which they are supposed to reply to, but they don't always do that. I haven't received a reply to my comments. I point out some misspellings. I point out, which I'm sure they have corrected, but the main thing that I pointed out they have not corrected. So how do they decide on what is causing? Can you set this so that I can see what's up there without turning around? Okay. Yeah. So the attribution is in Chapter 9 in IPCC 2007 and Chapter 10 in the forthcoming report. Here's what they do. They compare an incomplete adjusted model with one selected data set. And this data set disagrees with all the other data sets. And this comparison or this agreement is really an exercise in curve fitting, because you can adjust models to give you almost any result you want. There are enough adjustable parameters in these climate models to give you whatever you want. There's a cute story about a famous mathematician, John von Neumann. I once worked for him. He said, give me 4 adjustable parameters and I can model an elephant. And give me 1 more and I can make his trunk wiggle. So, you know, it's well known that you can make adjustments to these models by choosing the right parameters. The discontent we have with these so-called demonstrations, the evidence that the IPCC has shown us, has of course led to the establishment of NIPCC. And the first of these reports of the NIPCC is this one here. It's an overview. It was issued in 2008. The title, Nature, Not Human Activities, Control the Climate, Rules the Climate, that title is not mine. It came from Zbigniew Jaworowski, who has unfortunately passed away. One of our team, outstanding physicist who lived in Warsaw, Poland, who said you need a title that's punchy. It tells the story. Okay, so we dropped the title we had and we adopted this title. Not everyone likes it, but it tells the story. It's been translated into German, and there they call it something else. They call it the wrong climate forecasts. Okay, that's all right. It's also been translated into Italian, Spanish, and French. And now, the Chinese translation, which I'm sure you can all read. But the book, they published a whole book. No shortcuts. And the back cover of the book is in English. So the front cover is in Chinese, the back cover is in English, and you can read it. Nature is the main driving factor of climate change. A little more restrained perhaps than our title, but it tells the same story. I'll need an expert in Chinese to tell me what the front cover says, but I hope it says the same thing.
It is. Right.
Interesting, I was asked to write a foreword for this book, and since I didn't know what went into it, I had to be very careful in writing the foreword. So I kept stressing the fact that I don't know any Chinese and I can't read what it says. But, but I applaud the general spirit. I think that's what I said. It was a very carefully worded foreword, because I didn't know the people involved. Now I've met Kui Wei-hong. He's a professor, and his field is remote sensing, which used to be essentially my enterprise. So we're on the same wavelength, and he's a fine fellow. He organized another special symposium for us in Beijing at his institute, independent of the academy meeting. Now, one word about the Chinese Academy. I need to put this to rest here. The Academy, I think, is split on this issue. They have not endorsed our viewpoint explicitly. They've simply given us a platform. We don't quite know what's going on inside the Academy, but I'm sure it's the same kind of struggle that exists in the United States, but it's more open in China. In any case, the real decisions are not going to be made by scientists. They're going to be made at a much higher level, at the ministerial level of people who control development and economic growth in China. And we trust that they will make the right decisions. You've read in the paper, perhaps, that China is experimenting with cap and trade legislation. I've read this also. don't take it seriously. I don't think they're going to try to control CO2 emission, because this would mean restraining economic growth. I think what they're trying to do here is to improve energy intensity, that is defined as the amount of energy it takes to produce 1 unit of GDP, which essentially means increasing efficiency of energy use. That we should applaud. That is a good idea, increasing efficiency. You have to recognize that some of the electric generating stations using coal are very old. Their efficiencies of the order of as low as 11%. That's very low. Our average efficiency in the United States is about 35%. We can now build coal-fired power plants that have an efficiency of up to 60%. We heard about this yesterday.
Combined cycle using natural gas.
My guess is, and this is just my personal guess, that the Chinese are trying to improve the efficiency of generating energy so they can produce the same amount of energy with less coal. That's a good thing. I'll now quickly go through the rest. These are the volumes that have been published by NIPCC. The final volume will come out in September, called Climate Change Reconsidered number 2. The Chinese version is over here. They have excerpted the important parts. I can't tell what parts they've excerpted because I can't read it, but I trust that they've excerpted the important parts. Now, just to finish the discussion, I want to show you how the IPCC has produced its so-called evidence. First of all, they claim they fully understand all of the natural forcings. They don't. They don't even mention them. The most important forcing from the sun, from solar activity changes, gets very short shrift in the IPCC report and is not mentioned in the summary. They just ignore it. They claim that there's a major global surface warming between 1978 and 1997. That's reported by surface thermometers, but it's contradicted by all other temperature data. You've heard some of this yesterday from Anthony Watts. And then they claim that any disparity between such warming and an unforced model must be due to greenhouse gas forcing. That, I think, is stretching the logic rather thinly. So let's take a quick look. The black line shows the reported surface temperature. The red line shows the modeled, or the average model from CMIP5, which is the series of models that they've developed, that they've accumulated for the purpose of this exercise. Now, you see here a rather good agreement. Don't believe it. It's all curve fitting. You can adjust it to make it agree or disagree by adjusting the right climate sensitivity. And we don't know the sensitivity, or at least they don't know the sensitivity within a factor of 3. That's 300%. The agreement here, before 1960, shall we say, is not very good. And we know this from their own report. This shows the observed points. Here you see the warming, the cooling, another reported warming, and here's the red line. You see there's a poor agreement. They don't account, really, for the warming of between 1910 and 1940. And finally, they show again the reported warming here, black line, and here a model without carbon dioxide increase. And you see there's a gap. And they say this gap must be due to carbon dioxide. That's the whole proof. That's all the evidence they cite. Well now, the question is, does this increase really exist? I doubt it. It doesn't exist in the atmosphere. You see there's no increase in the atmosphere between here and here. It doesn't exist in models. It doesn't exist in the atmosphere. It doesn't exist in the ocean. The ocean data are published by the Hadley Center in England. You see a warming between 1910 and 1940, cooling, and a slight recovery, but the warmest years are still around 1940. Unlike the reported surface data. This is NMAT, nighttime marine air temperature. The warmest temperatures are around 1940, and it's only the super El Nino here that brings it up above 1940. So every data set we've looked at disagrees with the surface temperatures. And I'll show you the discrepancies. The land-based surface temperatures on a global basis show a difference between 1995 and 1942 of about half a degree. In the US, there's no difference. The ocean data show no difference. Nighttime marine air temperature, no difference. Ocean heat content, practically no difference. But satellite data, of course, they don't go back to 1942, but again, a difference of 0. Radiosondes, difference of 0. Proxies, difference of 0. So it's clear that the land-based surface temperatures are the ones that stand out and disagree with every other data set. Let me show you one more. Oops. Oh. Yeah, this one. This is published by GISS. That's Jim Hansen's outfit. I think it's going to be my last slide because this time is up. This shows the reported global surface temperature. You see the warming between 1910 and 1940, a cooling unexplained by carbon dioxide, and then a reported warming. And you see that the warming brings the temperatures up above 1940 by approximately, I'd say maybe half a degree, 0.5. Now, they also published the US record. And in the US record of stations that are better controlled, not well controlled, I'm tipping my hat here to Anthony Watts, not well controlled, but better controlled than they are the rest of the world, you'll see that the warmest years occur around 1940. Then there's a cooling, and there's a slight recovery. What will impress on you is that there is no real good evidence for a strong warming after 1975. This warming is probably all unreal, fake, not genuine, but this warming is genuine. So this is a point of view that we're trying to propagate. I think it'll be supported as we look at all the evidence that's available. We will try to convince people of this, but there's still a big puzzle. I will finally, in my final remarks, try to tell you what the puzzle is. We haven't figured it out yet. The puzzle is this. The atmospheric data from satellites, which I think are the best data we have, show no warming before 2000 and no warming after 2002. I think that's really the case. And we know from both theory and models that the surface data show approximately half a trend of the atmospheric data. So if the atmospheric data shows 0, surface data must certainly be 0, show a 0 trend. Now, why is it that the reported temperatures here show a warming, but the reported temperatures here do not show a warming? What is wrong with the reports? I'll leave that to you to figure out. It's still a puzzle. We're trying to work on this and provide a convincing explanation. I think this is probably a good place to stop. I had more material here if I ran out of time, but I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because I had a chance to tell you more and more about the political situation, EPA, and the situation in China. So thank you very much for your attention.
I agree with your remarks about Bush the Younger could have done a lot, and particularly up until 2007 when he had a Republican House and Senate. My question is, who was governor of Massachusetts in 2007? I do not know. Does anybody know?
Who was governor?
Yeah, Massachusetts sued EPA. The governor of Massachusetts had to have something to do with that. Who was it? Was Romney governor? That's my question. I don't know. Was he governor then?
Gee, I don't know. EPA during the Bush administration was run by a career guy, Johnson, who was pretty good, but he was not able to, I think, fight the bureaucracy. The EPA has now an ingrained bureaucracy that's all set for regulation. There's no way to change the EPA that I see. It takes a really strong administrator. The first person he put in there was Christy Whitman. Maybe you were thinking about her. She was governor of New Jersey. She was put in as administrator of EPA. She was completely unequal to the task, couldn't control the bureaucracy, and she resigned shortly after she was appointed.
I noticed in the court opinion, they reflected that, Michael McCracken is quoted extensively in that court opinion and saying a lot of things that we would disagree with. But the court opinion said that his affidavits were unchallenged. So do you have any insight as to why there was such a frail response by the Solicitor General?
I will rely on Jeremy to rephrase the question to me.
I think you're going to have to come closer and tell him, because I can't do that.
The court opinion cited Michael McCracken a lot, and that was based on unchallenged affidavits. Unchallenged affidavits is what the court said. So did not the Solicitor General do much to attack these, these unchallenged affidavits by McCracken and others?
The affidavit, the main affidavit that gained standing for Massachusetts was prepared by Michael Oppenheimer. I studied the affidavit. It said that Massachusetts was going to be covered by the ocean if any more carbon dioxide is emitted. At that time, Oppenheimer was chief scientist of the Environmental Defense Fund. It was the Solicitor General did not attack the affidavit. He wouldn't even listen to us. We couldn't get through to the Department of Justice. It was a very frustrating experience, believe me, because we clearly saw the holes, the faults of the affidavit, and we were sure that if we had prevailed and if the argument had been made before the Supreme Court, they would have dropped the case or would have decided in our favor.
Fred, you've forgotten more about global warming than I've ever known, so it's not for me to challenge you. But I've been concerned for some years that the warmists just keep lobbing, new lies and fraudulent claims at us, and at Heartland, we spend a huge amount of time trying to bat them out of the ballpark, and we just never ignore them. Joe Bass says that's what we have to do. I think it's a waste of a huge amount of energy. But I decided in the last few months to study the Russian literature and found a long list of scientists that are thoroughly convinced that we're not only warming, that we will soon be entering a fairly significant cooling cycle. And Joe let me write an article on global cooling and published it in the current issue of Environment and Climate News. And my point was as much political as scientific, that if in the eyes of the public we could divert the argument away from defending warming and promoting cooling, we may move further ahead. I mean, you say we're winning, and there's certainly a lot of data to show that. Of course, we're ignored, by the political movement of global warming. But I just feel that if everybody began to, and I hope everyone will read my article in Environment Climate News, if we'd start talking in our daily arguments about the likely probability that we are moving into a cooling period, we might move further ahead in getting the public on our side. Any comment?
Your points are well taken. My personal attitude is, I'm afraid, fairly conservative. That is to say, I do not make predictions about climate. It's a matter of sort of principle with me. I try to understand what happened in the past. I try to explain what happened in the past, try to figure out what the causes of past climate change were. The reason I don't make predictions is because I don't know what the sun is going to do. If someone will tell me what the sun will do, then perhaps I can figure out what the climate will be like.
Well, clearly, though, in looking at the sun data the last, let's say, 600 years, we had the medieval, warming when the sun was active. Then we, while I wasn't at Valley Forge with Washington, every time I read about that winter there, it's amazing people got through it. That was kind of the height of the cooling period after the medieval warming. And then clearly since Washington and Valley Forge, it appears we've been through 2 centuries of some level of warming, and now it's leveled out. And I'm convinced we're going to probably go into many, many decades of cooling. I really think, the trend is there. Using Scott Armstrong's concepts, I think you can show a fairly clear trend.
Yeah, if you're willing to extrapolate, that's fine.
You Americans always forget the Canadians. You talk about the Chinese, but you've already convinced the Canadian government that this global warming is a big money-grabbing scam, and you didn't mention that. But unfortunately, the Canadian government is following U.S. policy because they want to build a pipeline, and you know the rest.
The Canadian government does good things from time to time, and I hope they will continue to do good things. I should mention that one of the experts that the Chinese Academy is featuring in their symposium is Gordon McBean, whom some of you may know from Canada. He was head of the Canadian environmental effort, and is thoroughly despised by the Fraser Institute. So you get mixed reports from Canada.
It's clear that between your presentations and your work and the work of other people that have already spoken today in previous years, that we have the facts on our side, and we have shown with the wisdom of Dr. Armstrong this morning that their forecasts are wrong. Why aren't we succeeding? And that is, we haven't learned the lessons in Dr. Armstrong's other book, Persuasive Advertising. I think we need to spend some time with those ideas about how to get our ideas out to the public. And maybe we should ask Dr. Armstrong again to talk about how to advertise these ideas.
Yeah. Howard, I think we're winning on the science, on the facts, but it may be fairly irrelevant. I think the decisions are going to be made in the political arena, and unfortunately they're partisan. I wish they were non-partisan. I wish they were bipartisan, because the science should be supported by both parties in the correct way.
Okay. Most of us, or a lot of us, think that CO2 is not any kind of a problem. CO2 does radiation cooling, water vapor does more radiation cooling. The Earth's been cooled by radiation a long time, but in the past 800,000 years, the bounds of temperature has gotten tighter and tighter and tighter, and the last 10,000 years have been bound really tight. Something has a set point, and that has to be ice and water. Let's prove what is causing the temperature to be controlled and forget about the CO2 problems.
I'm not the expert on paleogeology. My friend Bob Carter is, and the climate has indeed been cooling for the last about 25 million years, and cooling strongly for the last 2 million years. And we've had, as you know, a series of ice ages. Geologists think it has to do with the fact that the North American and South American continents joined up, and that the ocean, the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were separated, and this affected climate in a profound way. Well, the Antarctic ice has been growing for 25 million years, and it still keeps growing.
The rearranging of the continents and the growth of the polar ice corresponds to the bounding of the temperature more tightly.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.